Welcome everyone to this live taping of Afikra Conversations. Our special guest is Dr. Shahd Alshammari, who is a Kuwaiti-Palestinian author and academic. She's the author of Head Above Water, which came out on Neem Tree Press in 2022. Shahd teaches literature and has written numerous stories and creative nonfiction. Her research areas include illness narratives and disability studies. She's the assistant professor of English at the Gulf University for Science and Technology, and she's authored an academic monograph, Literary Madness in British Colonial and Bedouin Women's Writing. Shahd, welcome to Afikra Conversations.
Thank you, Mike. I'm really happy to be here and really excited to be part of Afikra's wonderful initiative. I'm really also looking forward to, talking very, very much about the book and also getting your perspective, but also would love to hear from the audience at the end. So thank you all for being here.
Absolutely. So you can type your questions into the chat and we'll get to them at the end. So I guess the first question is, when you were a teenager, interested in high school, maybe 13, 14, if I said to you, you're going to be interested in disability studies, what would that 13-year-old have said?
What is disability? What is disability studies? I think it would have been a big question mark. We'd never heard of disability anywhere. So I grew up in Kuwait, but I was educated in an American school, so also with a kind of like an American curriculum. Disability was not a word that was said amongst teachers or colleagues or students or friends, family. You couldn't even see it on television. You couldn't see it in the media anywhere. I watched all the fairy tales that we all watched. I grew up watching, all these fairy tales that I fell in love with, like Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast. And I never thought, not even for 1 second, that it had anything to do with disability. Ariel losing her legs, exchanging that to be with an able-bodied man. None of that stuff actually felt like it had anything to do with the body. It just all seemed like it was just a fairy tale. So I think 13-year-old me would have been also very confused about why on earth is that a subject that anybody would want to be talking about, let alone study.
Yeah. So if you were to speak to that 13-year-old now, what is the sort of, not the pitch, but what is the explanation? Why should somebody study this?
It's kind of, I think simply, I would say something like, we all get sick one day. So parents get sick. You could get COVID, which is also something that now we're so, openly talking about. It's part of the human experience. It's part of our experience of being vulnerable human beings. We're not immortal, and that's something that as kids we don't even think about. We always think we're going to be, healthy and always, strong. And especially if you hadn't seen anyone around you, come down even with a bout of illness other than the flu, it'd be something that you wouldn't think about. But I think I would want, and I always say this, I do want middle schoolers, high schoolers to start developing a bit more of, terminology that isn't stigmatizing when it comes to people living with disabilities. We still have, especially in this part of the world, you see someone in a wheelchair, people will say things like, Alhamdulillah wa shukr, Alhamdulillah. The first thing they say is, Alhamdulillah, I'm not that person, which is in so many ways condescending and really problematic. It's done with the best intentions, but, nobody stops and says, how does that make the other person feel? The person were just so relieved, not to be in their shoes. So I think there's a long overdue conversation, and I think one of the best places to start would be actually in middle school, where students are starting to actually learn about, what it means to be living in a boy's body or in a girl's body. Gender is one of those topics in middle school, but disability isn't. And I think it just, for me, it makes perfect sense to start that conversation earlier rather than later.
Yeah. So Head Above Water is a memoir, right? And academics don't write memoirs typically, right? But there's a reason why this story is about your story. And so tell us a little bit about that, sort of like pull back the curtain, if you would, about how you shifted from being that 13-year-old for whom this wasn't an issue that was close to home to being somebody who definitely had to understand this new perspective.
So I think I'll start with just, let's go back. As an 18-year-old high schooler, I, woke up one day and I couldn't walk. I was diagnosed with MS, multiple sclerosis, which is a neurological illness that actually affects a lot of young adults. It's usually between the ages of 20 to 40. I mean, that's what the statistics say. That's not always the case. Sometimes you have kids around 13, 14 years old, and they actually get the same kind of diagnosis with the same kind of limitations of speech, limitations of movement. And there's a lot of questions still around these kind of, I would say, disabilities and illnesses that are relatively new to the Gulf. So there's a lot of also scientific questions about where that actually fits in terms of geographically speaking. What is the ratio of young adults living with neurological illnesses and disabilities? There's a lot of questions about, what the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the Gulf War, had to do with it, if there was anything to do with it in terms of, the pollution that took place in the air and all sorts of things. So I was one of those kids who was here during the invasion, and I remember playing and looking at black skies and thinking how beautiful that was. But those were black skies filled with, toxic air and oil that had been burnt. So fast forward a few years, and, I developed this illness that nobody had heard of before, none of my friends, none of my family members. And I continue, kind of learning as I go along, but also struggling to find any representation of illness anywhere in the books that I had fallen in love with. So I was a nerd who loved books, and still am, and I couldn't find these stories anywhere. So I studied English literature with a focus on, just narrative the way we know it, good stories, stories from the British canon, Shakespearean dramas, and disability was nowhere to be seen, let alone women with disabilities or any form of illness. It was always like a tragic representation, if there was any. So I ended up doing my MA and PhD for one sole reason, and I talk about it in the book. I simply wanted to dig deeper into literature and books. And I think for me, that was, one of the, I'd say one of the drugs that I chose to take. And it was a drug that I felt was keeping me alive and keeping me excited to be alive. Living with pain constantly was very difficult, and still is a very difficult place to be. And we're not equipped. We don't have these tools, and we don't really know what to do when illness enters the picture, especially as, again, young adults, people who think they're immortal, and then all of a sudden this becomes part of your reality. So as I dug deeper in books and academia and the literature, I went abroad. I went to the UK to study how madness, mental illness, is represented in literature. I still wasn't ready to talk about the body. I still wasn't ready to talk about the physicality of the body. So it was one thing to talk about the mind, which, not just in Arab culture, but also in Western culture, we tend to prioritize the mind, and we kind of stray away from the body. The mind is more powerful. Your thoughts control you. You have all of these myths that we, grew up with. So the mind was something I was interested in, but I had steered away from talking about the body or studying the body. It was still something very much culturally taboo. As I finalized my PhD at that time, my supervisor had a chat with me and said, Shahd, why don't you talk about how MS and how women's bodies are represented in literature and the media? And why don't you actually start by using the personal? And, just like you, Mikey, the first thing I said was, but, academics don't do that. And, I don't want to go down that road. I want to be seen as this respected, esteemed professor who's,
who focuses on the mind.
focuses on the mind, intellectual, does quantitative studies, someone who is going to produce research that's going to be valuable. Again, all of these myths that I had internalized. Also with the culture of academia, it was something I hadn't even realized, that I had internalized it so much that I was just repeating the same kind of narrative. And that's when she started introducing me to a lot of feminist writers who actually use the body as the starting point. So the starting point is the body, and then you gravitate towards the mind, and then you start thinking about, spaces, intellectual spaces, but you always start with the physical space. And that was something that I was just really surprised with, that you can actually use this body, this vehicle that for me had seemed like such a burden, to actually start thinking about other ways that we navigate the world and we navigate our identities and how we present ourselves in different spaces, in academic spaces, in social spaces, how we present ourselves, as a daughter, as an academic, as a friend. And all of this starts within the first home that we have, which is the body. And again, I always say this, for me, the idea of home is the body rather than a nation, so to speak. It's the closest thing that we have. We live within this body, and yet we don't pay attention to it. It's not something that we really think about until it calls attention to itself, until you've got COVID, or you're sick, or you've gotten into a horrible car accident, and now you have to navigate a new body. So I started thinking about how, I would kind of pursue a different career by not steering away from the body, but rather incorporating it into research. So that's when I started thinking about illness narratives, autoethnographies, and I think that's what I really want to emphasize. My research started with autoethnography. And autoethnography, rather than ethnography, which is the study of a researcher's study of a specific culture, autoethnography puts the self into that culture, and puts the self, puts the research as connected to the researcher, rather than just being objective and saying, this is the data, this is what I've collected, I've studied this group of people, and this is what they've said to me. The researcher is actually involved, and the researcher is allowed to be vulnerable. The researcher is allowed to say, that was heartbreaking when I interviewed so-and-so about their disability. That was difficult to think about. I started thinking about my own privilege. I started thinking about my own oppression, my own biases, and you put that into the research rather than just, shying away from it. So having, come across autoethnography, I started writing about the body. I started writing about the cultures surrounding me, not just my own cultures, Bedouin and Palestinian, but also academic cultures. So the various definitions of culture. And that's when I realized that this is a form of research. It's not simply creative writing. It's a form of research, autoethnography, that is. And still, you get a lot of people who say things like, no, that's not research. That's you just narrating your story, which is very dismissive, of course. But there's a lot of value in autoethnographies. And when I wrote Head Above Water, I was really, really influenced by autoethnography as a research genre, and memoir and illness narratives. So a bunch of things, really.
Yeah, can you give us, you had mentioned that you were inspired by a few different authors. Who are some of those authors?
So I think for me, it started out with a lot of Black feminist poets and authors, Bell Hooks, Maya Angelou, Audre Lorde, all of these, canonical names. And they were all talking about really having voice and agency, and how, they used their bodies. Of course, granted, they were talking about Blackness, and it's definitely not the same. But it was something that I started realizing we could take the conversation a bit further. So rather than just talking about race and gender, disability can be added into the mix. And it really complicates our understanding of a lot of stuff. So I was inspired by them and influenced by these writers. Also Arthur Frank, who's a sociologist. And again, when you talk about autoethnography and illness narratives and disability studies, it's not one category. We're talking about sociology, we're talking about autoethnography, poetry. It's a bit of everything. It's very, I think, it's very fluid and intersectional.
Yeah.
And I think Arthur Frank's book called The Wounded Storyteller, it's a great book that in which he, as actually a sociologist, as a professor, starts talking about his experience being diagnosed with cancer as someone very young. I think he was about 40 at the time. And it was something that wasn't very expected. Cancer not in his family, and all sorts of scientific reasons weren't there. So he starts looking at what it means to be wounded and also want to speak as a storyteller. And so he starts talking about how people who get sick and those with disabilities are usually spoken for by medical doctors, by family members. You go into the hospital and the doctor might speak to the person next to you who's not sick, who's able-bodied, and you're not actually given room or space to talk. And for him, that was a kind of like an eye-opener. When I read that, I started thinking about it culturally too. So a lot of times also Arab women are not given that room or that platform to speak, whether in the media, whether in what publishers choose to publish, whether what academics choose to research and publish. So again, this idea of space and voice and the mind, as connected to the body, again, it goes back to that.
I want to ask you a question, because I feel like there's a risk, there's a societal risk, right? When that often emerges when there's advocacy for groups of society that don't have as much of a voice or are less understood, their perspectives are not as prevalent. And when that advocacy takes place, sometimes there's this like, there is a byproduct where they become tokenized, right? And there's just like politically correct speech. And so let's just say whatever the less offensive word is without a real actual investment in understanding perspective. And just like, let's just not offend. So instead of saying, alhamdulillah, when, you say, بعتذر منك أو ما بعرف, I don't know, you say something that you think is less offensive, but without a real investment of understanding and inclusion, not for the sake of it, but inclusion because
political reasons.
There is actual perspective that is valuable for inclusion. So how do you navigate that, and who has done that best? I mean, like, what are some success stories that we can look at and say, okay, maybe in the Middle East we need to do that instead of that?
Well, I think it's globally, it's still very much, there's a lot of debate about, how to actually talk about disability, not just language-wise, but how do we represent it? And there's this debate amongst disability studies scholars, and it's always this idea of, is it a tragic we look at it as a tragedy, or do we look at the person with disability as having overcome the disability and thus becoming a inspiring persona or someone that we look up to? So it's usually in this dichotomy of either it's tragic or it's completely inspirational. We need to look up to you. We'd love to look up to you. Tell us your story so that we can feel better about how disability has kind of been done with. And it's constantly there. I have it personally in my life. I have it when people read the book. People come up to me and say, you're so inspiring. And then we get into this conversation of why it shouldn't be just inspiring. Again, if I wasn't living with MS, or if someone wasn't living with a disability, would you still say, you're inspiring for writing a memoir, for writing a narrative about your life? I don't think so. And again, it's because we have these myths in our mind still, culturally, socially. It's like a collective myth that people with illnesses and disabilities, that group, cannot do much. So when they do anything, it becomes something that's like a shock and inspirational. And I think this idea would probably benefit from being normalized if we actually introduce disability as part of a curriculum at schools. There's also a lot of, especially here, there's no inclusion. So, for example, you have classes in which those with disabilities, whatever they are, physical, intellectual, anything, is separated from able-bodied students. And then they only meet each other when they're 18 at universities.
Yeah, for the first time.
So it's a bit of a shock. It comes as a bit of a shock. And they're not really sure, how do I deal with you? How do I talk to you?
Yeah.
And I think, again, that brings me back to that 13-year-old question. If that had been something that was normalized, then it wouldn't be such a difficult kind of conversation to have, even with my own self.
Yeah.
So I think the difficulty is something that does need to be addressed without being tokenized. You're absolutely right. And I think I've seen this with publishers too, wanting to publish a narrative about disability, but still, is that narrative something that heals at the very end? Is that a success story? Or is it something that's not gonna sell? Again, it's how are we comfortable dealing with disability? It's still able-bodied people, able-bodied publishers, the media that's still pretty much in control of what gets shared and how that gets packaged in a comfortable way.
Yeah. What has the response been to your work and to this book in particular, maybe across the GCC, and then sort of when you zoom out and across the Middle East more broadly?
Well, honestly, the reason I wrote the book was because there wasn't anything that I had read except for one narrative by Egyptian author Radwa Ashur. Her book was called أثقل من رضوى, heavier than Radwa. It hasn't been translated into English, but it was basically her academic memoir in which she was writing about cancer, her cancer diagnosis, but also being part of the Egyptian revolution and, trying to navigate politically, academically, the body and the nation, all of these really, really complex ideas. That was the only book that I had seen and read. And, I've done my research, I've dug a lot because I was really looking for that. So having read that book, that's when I realized that even more pressingly important was the fact that I couldn't find anything in the Gulf region that was similar. I found something from Radwa Ashur, but not from the Gulf region. So when I wrote the book, it was a very, I don't want to say it was just a personal kind of, venture, but it was like a political one, a collective one. I want this sort of narrative to kind of be more, let's say, normalized, and a narrative that is going to be more common. So far the book was released end of May, so the few people that have read it, have shared personal feedback. A lot of readers happen to be women, and a lot of them have said things like, I wouldn't be able to do that. I wouldn't be able to write openly about the body, but thank you for doing that. I'd love to share my blog with you. And then they share private and personal works, but it means the work is there and the need is there, and these readers want to be reading this sort of stuff, but they also want to be writing this sort of stuff. So far, I'd say the reaction has been positive. Doesn't mean that, there haven't been sort of questions about, why would you do this? Like you said, there's a big question of what do academics write, and what actually counts as what would you spend your time doing? Is it an academic monograph that's going to be published by a big university press and is going to be read by a select number of people? So there has been that question. And I find myself constantly trying to defend this choice to actually use the body as part of not just my personal memoir, but also for research purposes, for starting a culture that will be reading more illness narratives, will be writing more illness narratives. So I think definitely I am still on the defense. I'm trying to defend the value of work that deals with something that seems to be very personal, but I actually think it's really universal. I really think illness is something that we all face down the line. If not by old age, then by randomness of life. So
okay, so let me ask you a question. Let's say some publisher or patron person comes to you and says, "Hey, listen, I'm going to give you some X sum of money to do the following project, okay? And you get to choose which one you want to do." fully funded, tons of support being thrown behind it. And they say, these are the three projects. One project is, we want you to write a young adult's novel inspired by Head Above Water. Focus on those 13-year-olds. That's one. Two, we want you to write a children's book series that is inspired by Head Above Waters, focus on sort of like 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, stuff like that. Or three, we want you to do writing workshops all across the Gulf that are inspired by Head Above Water, but we are trying to get stories, and those stories are going to be collected into a collection, and it will be all these different blogs made unprivatized.
Wow.
Which one would sound more fun to you, and which one do you think would move the needle more?
I mean, they're also great, but I think the writing workshops, only for one reason. I really believe in this kind of personal human connection. Books have a great way of, inspiring readers and connecting the author to the reader. But, for me, it's in those really tiny moments within a classroom that really change not just perspectives, but it changes lives. I had that happen to me as a student, and, I do it every day with my students. I try to change some kind of, thought process. And sometimes it does change lives. So I think that personal human connection with these writing workshops would be great, not just because I'll have that kind of connection with them, but they'll also get to know one another. And there's a sort of vulnerability that comes with, writing about your own pain, writing about your own, story, and sharing it with people right next to you. And writing workshops have that value behind them. So I think it would definitely be a lot.
Have you seen in your time at teaching at your university in Kuwait, have you seen an increased interest from your students in disability studies? And to write about this stuff?
Well, to be honest, that's not a course that's offered, but what I do is in every course that I teach, whether it's Shakespeare or whether it's poetry, 20th century poetry, or short story writing, I actually introduce disability as part of that curriculum. And they're always really fascinated by it, kind of just like how I started the conversation about fairy tales. They're always in awe that, we've, kind of consumed all of these fairy tales without thinking about what they could possibly mean to people living with disability. Like, for example, Scar from The Lion King, the actual name is Scar, and he's that evil villain. But again, it makes you really wonder, if it's something so common, why is it not being spoken about? So I think there is an interest. I teach a short story writing class, and I found that a lot of students actually want to write narrative nonfiction. I start thinking they want to just, stick with fiction, but they end up writing narrative nonfiction once they understand its power.
Yeah, I think it's funny. I was reading an interview that you said most people like fiction, and there isn't as much space for narrative nonfiction. But I think in 2022, in a world of Instagram stories and vloggers, people think, I think, in narrative nonfiction, because they're trying. So they've been ushered into this world where they're constantly telling their own stories, and thinking in crafting those stories in those ways. So narrative nonfiction, I think, it doesn't surprise me that that's so appealing.
Yeah, I think in this part of the world we are getting there, but I find that students struggle a bit with that, especially women. Again, it goes back to this idea of voice. Is my story something that I am allowed to write about? Is my story one that will make a difference to anyone? Should I actually share these secrets? So I think it's different depending on who's speaking to, and who's listening, not just who's speaking, but who's listening to. And in these kind of workshops and in these kind of classes, you do get a sense of, I think, safety when you do share these stories.
Yeah. I want to ask you a question about the note that one of those women said to you about the courage it takes. Do you feel like you're being courageous? Do you feel like you're doing something dangerous? Does it feel high stakes when you write about this stuff? And if so, what is the motivation? Like, where does that actual motivation come from, and what are you telling yourself?
So I think I started my creative writing career by writing poetry initially. And then I wrote Notes on the Flesh, which is short stories and a collection of stories also dealing with disability. And then I moved into illness narratives, memoir, autoethnography. So it wasn't just a, a straight, clear path to narrative nonfiction. And I think that's where I'd say courage comes. I wasn't just, ready for that. It took me a while to actually navigate writing very, not just, truthfully, but vulnerably, and knowing that there might be, negative reactions, there might be criticism, there might be feedback that I'm not comfortable with. There'll be interviews that I'm not comfortable with. And for me, that felt like, I needed to do it. The motivation, I think, comes from me being really invested in making sure that these narratives help someone, because I was an 18-year-old who didn't find any sense of belonging or any sense of representation anywhere. And I'm amongst the youth all the time because I still teach. And for me, that was the kind of the motivation or the drive to put that story out there, to put that narrative out there, so that they could feel like there was a sense of representation for them too. And again, just that feeling of community. And I think that's where I feel like I'm still trying to be courageous. I hope that there will be another book in which I can explore things even more openly. Of course, again, being an academic and still in the industry, there's also that kind of what is the book about? Why is it not an academic monograph, and so on? Or why is it not fiction? Why is it nonfiction?
You were talking about the reframing of the sort of fairy tales and Disney stories and stuff like that. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm curious if you've ever thought about what are some of the sort of iconic stories about the region and iconic figures, the scars of the regions, so to speak, who, when seen through a disability studies lens, we can sort of reinterpret their story and their place in society. Are there any people who sort of come to mind? Like, one of the people who sort of jumps out at me is sort of like Mazieda's story is really, really interesting. And when you sort of, after you look through it for a second time, you're like, oh, okay, so there's much more there than sort of is first presented. Are there other figures like that sort of come to mind?
I mean, I'm sure you've heard of course, Juha stories.
Mm-hmm.
I always thought about Juha as, we learn something from these stories, but there's a sense of humor there. And I've always felt like Juha could be, a bit, he could be someone who's on this autism spectrum. He could be someone who really doesn't kind of understand how we navigate social settings and different social settings. We don't know much about Juha except, he has these weird questions and, usually they're laughable, but then we learn the lesson from that. I mean, I'd have to think about it. Maybe Majnoon Layla also. I'd want to kind of look into that, deemed as mad. And again, that has a lot to do with how mental health is understood. An able-bodied man who falls in love and is suddenly mad. There's a lot of dangers with that too. There's a lot of folk tales that we have. We scare a lot of kids who don't go to sleep with these folk tales, like a really scary looking woman who has a lot of scars and she'll only come at 7 p.m. if you don't go to bed. She'll come for you. And again, that's how these myths get really, really ingrained in these kids' minds. They're terrified. There's one character who's, Saf Leaf, they call her, and she's supposed to be really tall and scary. And again, height as monstrous rather than just, average.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. This would be an interesting sort of like little side project.
Yeah, I think so. Project. You just made me think, yeah.
Yeah, even like historical figures, like musicians and politicians and writers and stuff like that who can be reimagined. So I want to go to the quick Q&A, and then we're going to have some questions from the audience. But maybe before we do the quick Q&A, what are you working on right now?
Well, currently I'm thinking about a new book after Head Above Water, but also with that kind of a desire to continue the conversation about women's bodies, about disability and illness. And I think when the pandemic hit, there was a huge interest. Suddenly, everybody was talking about, you know, what it means to have access. What it means to be ill. It was something that we all suddenly realized was part of our human experience. So yeah, that's the current attempt at the new book. Yeah,
I think there's something there. I mean, for sure, the idea of access and being stuck at home, right? Not being able to move, being forced to be isolated. I think there's obviously a lot to learn there. When that stuff happens, okay, so I have to ask you, right? Because there's a sense of humor under there, right? When you hear sort of people complain like, "Oh my God, it's impossible. I'm stuck at home. I don't have access. I can't live like this." Do you eye roll? Is it an eye roll? Like, oh my God,
I think it is. You know, my best friend asked me that yesterday, and he was like, you know, why do you eye roll? Why do you do that? And I think it was just like a welcome to the other side, you know, welcome to the other side of the world, which we will all visit one day. And I keep saying that because it's, you know, bizarre to me how this conversation was only started when the pandemic hit. Even academia started becoming a bit more flexible with deadlines and timelines, and having students who are sick who are not able to meet the deadline, you give an extension, when previously we had these really rigid kind of understandings of meeting your deadline, of producing decent work. But when somebody gets COVID now, even when we look at the work, we're a bit more understanding that, given the limited energy capacity, we're grateful that they just submitted. So it's really bizarre that we've just started talking about access, and we've just started talking about, how to make environments and spaces more accessible, how we can be more flexible in our understanding of others' fatigue, of others' energy limits, how we can actually have online conversations rather than in-person ones. For a lot of people with disabilities, it's really hard to go to a building that's not accessible, or even just to go to an interview rather than have it on Zoom. And, with all these Zoom interviews and all of this kind of, transformational thinking, it really made me stop and think, wow, it took a pandemic to get people thinking about the other side of life.
Amazing. Okay, let's open up. Yeah. Let's do the quick Q&A. Then we have a couple questions in the chat. So the first one is, what are you reading or watching these days?
I'm reading a book called A Still Life. I'll put the title in the chat maybe later. It's a memoir about somebody who has been living with chronic illness, and she's been spending all of her time alone, and it's called A Still Life. And so she tries to write about what value can we find in a life that is still.
Cool. Are you watching anything these days?
Love on the Spectrum. It's on Netflix, and it's a reality show that deals with people living with autism and how they navigate relationships and the dating life. Cool.
Amazing. Okay, who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
Maybe Maya Angelou, because I really love her work, and I think she would have been a great conversationalist, someone to talk to.
Yeah. That's an understatement for sure. Yeah. I think she's also hilarious.
Yeah,
I think she's underrated. Definitely. Her sense of humor is underrated. I think she'd be a fun person to hang out with. Yeah. What do people misunderstand about your work?
I think it's always, why are you writing about something so personal? Sometimes I'm accused of narcissism. That's a word that it's been thrown at me when I was starting to think about publishing narrative nonfiction or even doing autoethnography. And I think that's what I still struggle to kind of explain to people. It's not just about me. So
amazing. And the last one is, whose work do you admire or are inspired by, inside or outside of your profession, either one?
I think for me, it would definitely be the sociologist I mentioned too, Arthur Frank. That's I think the person who changed my life in terms of his work.
So I've heard you mention Arthur Frank before. If there is one book to read, what do you suggest?
The Wounded Storyteller.
The one that you mentioned before.
Yeah,
Wounded Storyteller.
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay. All right. So we have a couple questions in the chat. We're going to start with Alice. Alice, I think you want me to read it, so I'm going to go ahead and read it unless you want to chime in. Okay, the question is, regarding the topic of representation and privilege, do you encourage able-bodied authors to write about characters with disabilities? For example, Kuwaiti-American author Layla Al-Ammar was heavily criticized for writing about a Syrian refugee while being Kuwaiti.
Yeah, I think that's it's always about who gets to speak and whose narrative actually counts. When it comes to fiction, I think it can be a little bit more flexible, but I would definitely say I think I prefer for the narratives to be by those who are actually living with disabilities, telling their own stories. It's that disability studies motto, nothing about us without us. And I think it's really important that, you know, we get to hear it from those living with disabilities rather than writing about them. So I'd be very careful if, you know, I'm an able-bodied author and, you know, I decide to write about disability. The least I could do is probably, you know, really include that voice, maybe do the research, maybe ask if I'm getting it wrong. I think there will still be some bias, but.
Cool. The next question comes from Sarah, who asked me to read it. What language do you predominantly write in, and how has that impacted both your ability to express, frame, and position your story, and also the reception it has received? What limitations of language have you faced?
So I write in English, I think in Arabic, but I write in English. And again, that goes back to the, you know, the American schooling. I feel very comfortable in English. I don't feel like I'm making a political choice or anything. It comes to me very, very naturally. And the limitation has been, I'm not able to actually write in Arabic. So Arabic publishers or Arab publishers would struggle to find value in publishing something like this if it's not in Arabic. And finding a Western publisher was also quite difficult because they wanted the work to originally be in Arabic and then translated into English. So they wanted an Arab author to be writing in Arabic. So I hope that kind of.
Cool. A question from Rumi. Wanted to ask Shahd on future aligning film themes on disability.
Film themes?
I'm not sure what that means, but I think let me try to interpret what that means. Maybe, I'm not sure actually. Rumi, if you can type a little more about it, that would be great. I have a question from Peter. Would love to hear more reflection on how increasing attention to disability by governments and from society interacts with lived experiences.
No, thank you for that, Peter. Actually, you know, the government has been doing a great job over here. There's a lot of rights, legal rights. There's a lot of privileges too. I have to be honest. There's a lot of care given from the government to people living with disabilities. However, hidden disability or invisible disability is still falling quite behind. There's still a very long process in which you have to prove the illness or the invisible disability to government entities, to the medical doctors. So I think it still needs a lot of work. The lived experience kind of is in conflict with how the medics, to a larger extent, the government understands disability. I think there needs to be more attention paid to lived experience and also the involvement of people with disabilities to actually be, you know, in these big positions of authority. And that's not the case yet.
Can I tag something onto this question?
Yeah.
What is unique, if anything, or what is different about the reality of folks in the Arab world who are living with a disability versus folks in the US or in Europe or in other parts of the world. Is there a unique flavor that sort of colors, a unique color that sort of shades their experience that needs to be appreciated that I might be sort of blind towards?
Well, I mean, it's a very general question, but I think generally, again, very generally here, there is a lot of privilege that is being offered by the governments over here when it comes to people with disabilities. The government does really put in this, they take care of you, so to speak. And I see a lot of conversations on Twitter about how, some Western governments, for example, if you're disabled and you decide to get married, you might lose governmental support. And a lot of people actually don't get married because of that. So that was shocking for me to read. So I think in terms of governmental support over here, there's a lot of it. I think where the changes is the social stigma. Again, I'm generalizing here, but I think there's more social stigma over here rather than in other Western populations.
Gotcha. Okay, amazing. So we have a question from Catherine. The huge number of those living with long COVID has expanded the conversation about disabilities to include them, though they were not born with that disability. How do you see that development, and could it be helpful?
I mean, I think it is helpful because now we're starting to talk about fatigue, something that, a word that people actually used to use all the time is just, I'm tired. Now it's actually being looked at as an actual side effect or symptom of long COVID, and which is opening the conversation to start talking about chronic fatigue syndrome, MS, other neurological disorders in which fatigue is a huge part of the illness. So I think there is a benefit to discussing long COVID. Medics are even more likely to understand. So if I visit a GP today, they're more likely to even understand the term fatigue because immediately they relate it to long COVID. And then I kind of divert them to thinking about, okay, what it means in this specific situation.
Yeah, it's not just that you're tired and you're weak. It has, yeah. Okay, so Rumi retyped the question. Basically, films produced in the Middle East and Asia do not do much on disability as a storyline as compared to Hollywood. And I wonder how we can bring that on mainstream cinemas in the region, as these regions have huge populations who are suffering. The same goes with the African region as people all develop all kinds of other illnesses. And especially in light of the movie that won Best Oscar, the Oscar Best Film for last year was a movie produced by Apple called Coda, that is somewhat related to this. So it's an interesting question for sure.
I mean, thank you for that, Rumi. I've looked at a lot of media and theater, especially in the Gulf and to a larger extent Egyptian cinema, and disability is I think horribly represented. It's always really monstrous and it's always really tragic, and you don't get to see any sort of plot line in which there's even love involved. Love is always taken away from the person who has a disability in the movie, or it's always seen as tragic. And I know the other side of it would be to tokenize and make them look like, or make us look like inspirational, but the conversation still hasn't even started in this part of the world. There's a lot of shows that kind of give you a lesson. They use disability as a metaphor. The character decides to be rebellious against their parents, and then suddenly they wake up blind, and there's the punishment right there. So, and it just kind of keeps perpetuating these ideas. So you're right, and I wish I was a filmmaker. I think I'd do something about that, and I really would love if like writers and directors paid a bit of attention to these storylines. And it's fascinating how it's still not there. You see a lot of gender now. You see a lot of films about women and their narratives, but disability is still not there.
It's interesting because one of the things that I think is missing about a lot of these types of conversations is an admission that in order to have a conversation, you need to say words,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And when you say words, there's a risk that you use the wrong words and that you say something offensive and that you
Yes.
unintentionally offensive, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And one of the things that I think is lost, and especially in the US, is a very deep fear of being offensive,
Yeah.
unintentionally. And so I would rather not talk.
Yeah.
And so I really wonder how we get around that, how we can start allowing people to say, hey, it's okay if you say something wrong by accident, if it is in service to having a deeper understanding.
Yeah, I think because it's going to be a learning process, you will definitely make mistakes, and that's why I said, the classroom is probably a really safe space, like a workshop, because people will definitely make mistakes and will be open to being corrected. I think that's part of it. There's a fear of making a mistake and, also having to kind of check your own bias and check your own misunderstandings. So,
yeah. Well, Shahd, thank you so much for doing this and for checking our biases and helping us create this safe space. It's really, really a pleasure to be able to explore this with you.
Thank you, Mikey. I loved it. It was really awesome. And, I'm so happy that, Afikra started this conversation. It's one of those conversations, I've been wanting to see. So I'm looking forward to more of them. And thank you also to the people who gave, such awesome comments. But the questions also really made me think. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely. This will go up on YouTube tomorrow and up on our podcast. So please, 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 if there are folks out there who should have heard this conversation or who would have loved to hear it, please share it widely. It's really, really important that we have these types of conversations as broadly as we can. Enjoy your day or your evening wherever you are. We have our last event of this academic year tomorrow, and so we're excited about that. And we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.